Welcome back to ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidell. We're going to talk on community matters about the Titan submersible today with Admiral Paul Zukunft and with Gene Fidell, my brother. And we're going to explore what happened, and we're gonna figure out what the issues are. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Uh, Paul, Gene.
Aloha.
Greetings.
Let's start with you, Gene. Can you give us a sort of journalistic review of what we should know about this? There's so much to know, and it's complex because as we speak, it's getting more complex. What happened?
The short version is there has grown up a kind of tourism of members of the public being able to see and descend to the site where the Titanic lies in the North Atlantic. And this is effectively a kind of tourism. It's tourism for the wealthy, and it's conducted under private auspices. And most recently, a company in Washington State put together a program using their submersible with the appropriate name Titan to take five wealthy individuals down for effectively a sightseeing visit to the site of this catastrophic event from the second decade of the last century. This resulted that there was a casualty, as everybody knows, a catastrophic failure of the submersible. Five people who were on board, including the operator, died. Most recently, the hull of the submersible has been found and recovered, along with some human remains, which presumably are probably still fairly well preserved since it's cold 2 miles down. And now, of course, there's a range of investigations that are being conducted both in the United States and Canada. And people are trying to figure out what happened, why it happened, and what it means. So that's the very short version. The current activity, since the recovery phase is over, is a Marine Board of Investigation convened by the U.S. Coast Guard, and that process is just beginning. And we can talk as the show proceeds on what a Marine Board of Investigation entails and how it's likely to unfold.
It's a fair question for Paul Zukunft. Paul, thank you for joining us. We don't have a former commandant of the United States Coast Guard on the show every day, so we did have you a couple of years ago, but since then, no more former Coast Guard commandants. Thank you for showing up today. Really appreciate that.
Well, thanks for having me, Jay.
Gene mentioned that there's a Marine Board on this, and certainly the Coast Guard is interested because the Coast Guard is interested in general with safety of life at sea, and you get into questions of whether this vessel, and I call it vessel loosely, it was just big enough to contain those five people. It was not very big, and there are questions about its design and manufacture, of course, but it wasn't certified. They didn't even ask for certification, nor did they ask for classification under the Lloyd's classification system. It was really outside, normal channels completely. So tell me, why is the Coast Guard interested? Why the Marine Board, and what can the Marine Board do?
So it'll do a number of things, Jay, and it may result in regulatory changes. To begin with, there are licensing requirements for carrying passengers for hire. It's 6 passengers or more. I don't think it's a coincidence that they had 5 and not 6 passengers. So maybe we need to revisit what we call a six-pack license, if you will, when you're carrying passengers for hire. And we're entering an era of exploring new frontiers, commercial ventures that go into outer space. And quite honestly, the least explored frontier is in the deep, deep ocean. And you can imagine the challenge if I was John Mauger, the commander of the First Coast Guard District, and you get the initial call from your command center and say, "Hey, we've lost communications with a vessel," so we immediately launch to the last known position. Oh, but by the way, it might be 13,000 feet below the surface of the ocean, and we frankly have nothing in our inventory to conduct a search at that depth. Really no former knowledge that this ship was going to set sail, that they were going to engage in this expedition. And what contingencies for a worst case did they have short of these passengers signing a letter of indemnity that, this could go wrong and there could be fatal consequences. So there's a whole litany of things. But at the end of the day, the purpose of the Marine Board is to prevent recurrence of something like this ever happening again.
Are you suggesting that maybe in the future the Coast Guard jurisdiction should be expanded to cover this kind of adventure tourism using devices that have really not been certified, going places that that no man or woman has ever gone before? I mean, should we be asking the Coast Guard to look further in situations like this going forward?
And certainly the Marine Board will do that. And so if you look at the command structure for the search and ultimately the recovery of some of the debris from the Titan, this was all done with what they call a unified command. So you had obviously Ocean Gate's there, the Coast Guard's there, NOAA Woods Hole is there, the Navy is there, Canada is there. We even had a French ship there. So you had probably at least half a dozen subject matter experts looking at this. And the Coast Guard is not the subject matter experts of operating vessels at extreme depths, but there are plenty of others. So this could actually be done in a collaborative way. And I would expect the Marine Board will bear that out. Really, the purpose of this isn't so much a fault finding body, but more so an opportunity to prevent such a recurrence should anyone else want to entertain and into exploring the deep depths what I would call in an adventure tourism type fashion.
Student related, do you think the report of what's his name? I think his name is Aaron Neubauer,
Jason
uh, uh,
Newbow.
Jason Neubauer, captain, will be made public?
Oh, absolutely. So, Jason, when he was a commander, I handpicked him to do the Marine Board of Investigation for the sinking of the El Faro back in 2015 while I was the commandant. Some similarities with El Faro. We had a last known position. We launched a search in the middle of a hurricane, by the way, Hurricane Joaquin, off the coast between Jacksonville and Puerto Rico. And we received a report from the Navy using their sensor arrays that said, "Hey, we heard what sounded like an underwater explosion near where the last known position of El Faro was." We continued that search for over a week. The only thing we found was a survival suit. No humans were recovered from that. And the vessel did, in fact, sink. But just because it sank doesn't mean, hey, no one could have come to the surface. Some of those very same factors came into play in terms of the search planning for Titan. Is there a possibility they surfaced? There was a current that may have taken them, downstream. We don't know if they had a distress beacon. So if they came to the surface, was there a beacon that would then allow us to pinpoint their exact location? So a lot of unknowns in that as well. And then I'll just say this: I was intimately involved with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill back in 2010. I was the federal on-scene coordinator for over 7 months. And at first, it was a search and rescue case. And as you know, a huge, huge tragedy when the Deepwater Horizon exploded, loss of life. And then several days later, using ROV technology, um, we noticed that there was oil seeping from the drill pipe, the riser, where the blowout preventer had been. And so now we have an oil spill, originating in over a mile deep water. So here we are again, challenged in the deep depths of the ocean, in looking at the state of technology, and not necessarily the Coast Guard, but others, and quite honestly, in the commercial sector, that's where a lot of this technology exists, especially with ROVs and such.
I looked at Wikipedia. I told you where there's a very detailed report about what happened. Quite the authoritative report. It looks like some military organization or some people associated with some of the salvage companies wrote it up. But one thing is struck me is that there were multiple redundant safety systems on the submersible, and none of them were able to save the people. And I suppose Jason Newbar will be looking at that to see whether they were adequate and why they didn't work. Gene, let me turn to you. By the way, the name of the Titan was actually Cyclops 2. Don't ask me why, but that was the trade
Mm.
name of that vessel. There are legal and admiralty issues all around this. And I wonder at first, there was a waiver. They all signed a waiver, and the waiver had multiple warnings about, the lethality, the risk, the danger of dying in this adventure. Is that enforceable?
I'd like to see the document. It's been described, and as I understand it, it refers something like 7 or 8 times to the fact that this voyage may subject you to a risk of serious injury or death. But I'd still like to see the document. I would say, assuming it was properly lawyered, and you have to assume that that got done right. Um, it would be awfully hard to invalidate such a waiver because you're not talking about like the first 5 names in the North Branford, Connecticut telephone directory. These people, this is 5 well-to-do people who were knowledgeable in the ways of the world, who presumably had advice of people giving them advice. They each put up $250,000 for this. So you're not talking about just the person on the street. You're talking about presumably knowledgeable, uh, competent people who could give an effective waiver. Now, if for some reason there's something in there that gives a hook, uh, the lawyers are going to be looking at that. I mean, some admiralty lawyers, they're called proctors in admiralty, are going to be occupied with the Titan casualty for years uh, on questions of liability, the effectiveness of the releases, and so forth. So I think that that's going to be a major bone of contention. For example, was there an implied warranty of, wait for it, seaworthiness? And if there was, and I would certainly look into that if I were representing either anyone in this scenario, the estates of the decedents, obviously. Um, I'd want to see if admiralty law, maritime law contemplates an implied warranty of seaworthiness, and then was the submersible seaworthy? And just from the news accounts that we've gotten so far, there are people who raised the red flag before this voyage, well before this voyage. And just stay tuned. This story is not going to be done in a week or 2 or 3 months. It's going to be hanging around for a long time, and it's going to be carefully gone over. There are other issues. There are serious regulatory issues. For example, this of course happened in international waters, way off the Canadian coast. Canada has an interest. I think the mothership, I believe, was Canadian flagged. Correct me if I'm misremembering that. The operator of the submersible was a company from Everett, Washington State. So there's a U.S. interest simply there. There was a French national on board. There were 2 people who were from Pakistan, but actually resident in the UK. So you can see, the makings of really quite a complicated legal uh, context. And all of those countries presumably are going to be actively monitoring the conduct of the Marine Board of Investigation.
Does the Marine Board investigation report play in the litigation to follow?
Well, I'll take that one, Jay.
Okay.
So what the Marine Board will do, obviously there's going to be findings of facts, but going forward, it also come up with a series of recommendations. And those recommendations may result in a rulemaking process. And again, once it's completed, that is a public facing document. So, that'll be available for public consumption once it's complete. A Marine Board, there's some debris recovered. So forensics can be done on that. I can only speculate in terms of how do you replay what caused the implosion in the first place. That could be it'll take whole of science to try to pinpoint that. But at the end of the day, that is really designed to prevent recurrence and not so much litigation. But those findings of fact, since they are publicly consumable, can be revisited for further litigation.
Yeah, the Marine Board could serve as what lawyers call a discovery tool. Except for those parts of the hearings that deal with classified information, and there presumably is some classified information because the Navy's submarine sensing system was involved. But aside from anything that's classified, a subject about which we're all experts now, thanks to former President Trump, those parts of the hearings are going to be open to the public, and I'm sure they'll be covered intensively by the media.
What about one thing about limitation of liability, Gene? Isn't there something that limits the liability of the vessel to the value of the vessel?
It's even worse than that. It's the Limitation of Liability Act, which dates back to the 19th century, and all the involved countries have something like that. The question is, there's a choice of law question, which one would apply? But the concept is that if a vessel owner, if the owner of a vessel that's involved in a casualty brings an action to limit liability in an appropriate admiralty court, that owner can escape liability beyond that owner's liability is limited to the value of the vessel, and it's the value of the vessel where it is, which means the number is zero if you're talking about a destroyed submersible at 2 miles down. So the admiralty lawyers and the people who teach admiralty law in the United States, Canada, and elsewhere are going to be all over this. It'll be one, the whole thing is tragic and very compelling, but it's also going to be a teachable opportunity as well as an opportunity for taking a fresh look at the possible need for new legislation and regulatory programs.
It's not just the individuals who died in their estates making claims against the company that organized the tour, and that could be as a group, I suppose, or it could be somehow consolidated as a group, or it could be individual. But you suggest that there'll be cross claims and third party claims in the design and construction of this vessel, right? So it's not just the wrongful death claims, right?
Yes, and one major issue, as is the case in every admiralty, the maritime casualty, is what about insurance?
Yes, thank
So
you.
the people at Lloyd's of London, there's some syndicate. They're called syndicates. That's the Lloyd's is an interesting business venture. It's really a collection of syndicates, individuals who assume the risk and write the policies. There's one or more syndicates who have an interest in this because they may be on the hook for something here. And we haven't heard anything about that, but trust me on this. The Committee of Lloyd's, which is the governing body, and whatever syndicate or syndicates insured anything or anyone here, they're going to be all over this. So this is going to be quite complicated legally.
Going to make new law, new admiralty law, which is like a contradiction in terms. Uh, Paul, you're whether you're an engineer per se, I know you studied engineering at the academy and all that, and you've seen in your career a lot of engineering. And I'm adding to that it really does seem like the hull of this submersible collapsed. That's what we get so far. Parts of it have been recovered enough to make at least a preliminary conclusion that the hull was compressed by the pressures of the seawater at what 2.5 miles down, and it was compressed and collapsed, and the death was probably instant. But so we have to look, and I'm sure that the investigation will look at exactly what about that hull. The hull was apparently made of carbon fiber. There is already an issue as to where it came from. The operators have said that it came from Boeing. Boeing says we have no record of providing carbon fiber for this vessel. In fact, the vessel had a problem in terms of the integrity of the hull a couple of years ago. It's not brand new. Excuse me, it wasn't brand new off the shelf when this happened. And the hull had been rebuilt after that initial problem with it a couple of years ago. So I think one of the issues that will be covered is whether a carbon fiber hull is appropriate and how it was manufactured and so forth. What your thoughts about the role of the hull of that submersible in this disaster?
I would first look, Jay, at the viewport and what materials went into that viewport. Is that's now embedded into a different material, in this case, carbon fiber. And then within that carbon fiber hull, you've got a titanium capsule. So you have some dissimilarities of materials that go into this. And what was the pressure rating of that viewport to begin with? The reading I've done, it was not rated for the depths at which the vessel was operating. So there are a number of factors just in terms of the material integrity that went into this particular design. And even before you look at that, what testing measures went into place before you actually put human occupants into this? We did not put humans into outer space until we could have some assurance that they were going to return alive. And so I think there's a whole set of testing protocols that need to be questioned as well to determine the adequacy of the materials that went into this. And as Gene had mentioned, there was no certification process. I mean, we've seen the pictures of the PlayStation controller for propulsion and so forth. So, it looked like there could have been a number of workarounds still to be determined by the Marine Board. But to your point, we've got various materials that went into the construction. It all takes is a single point of failure, and at an atmospheric pressure of 380 times of what it is here at sea level. It's going to be catastrophic if there's any failure whatsoever in the hull, the viewport, or any of the other materials that went into its construction.
It strikes me from the point of view of of the U.S. military in general. We may not have a lot of vessels that'll go to that depth. And at the same time, we do need vessels that'll go to that depth. And of course, that would all be classified because who knows what's at the bottom and how that plays in national defense. But it seems to me that when this investigation is complete and we look carefully at the design and manufacturing materials in the hull, we're going to know more about how to make vessels that go to that depth. And thus there's going to be some kind of new information, new techniques that surface. I hate to use that term. That surface as a result of the investigation, where the American government military then has better techniques, better equipment to go to depths of 2 miles plus.
So I'm not sure it was James Cameron, but there have been other exploratory manned vessels that have gone to the very greatest depths of the Marianas Trench. And I'm not sure if that was a tripwire, just like when Lord Hillary summited Mount Everest, and people said, I might want to try that." And you look at the number of fatalities of people trying to summit Mount Everest. But was that kind of an aha moment for people to say, wow, people would pay big money to explore the great depths. Because quite honestly, the best way to survey that is not with manned platforms. You know, the ROV technology is state of the art, and they're tethered, they're recoverable, some are autonomous. But at the end of the day, there is no risk to human life.
Yeah, that's one great big lesson. When they went down to find the remnants of the submersible, they didn't send another submersible down there. They had a remote operated vehicle that went down there. And I think the US Navy had that. I'm not sure. And so maybe that's one great big lesson, that it's really not a good idea to send people down, at least now, to that depth when we have remote vehicles that'll go to that depth. And from a military intelligence point of view, that's where we should put our money, right?
I think this is a great lesson learned. Yeah, yeah. This is
Yeah,
a threshold where the risk is so great and the consequences are tragic.
yeah. Gene, you wanted to say,
Just to expand or maybe shift I'll say expand the focus a little bit. The this whole episode, which as I said is, it's going to be with us for a while, it's unfolding still, is very rich on a number of levels. The the impulse to explore is a fundamental human impulse, probably since the late Middle Ages, when people like Magellan thought, oh, why don't we sail around the globe? We realize this is not flat. The earth isn't flat, it's round. Let's do that. Or let's sail to the Americas. Or sail to the Orient, actually. Turns out that the American continent was in the way. Or let's find the Northwest Passage. I mean, this is a deep rooted uh, human impulse. So that's one observation. And it's an impulse we still experience today. We're going to the moon. We're going to put a person in space. Now, that actually had something to do with the Soviet Union and Sputnik and all that stuff. But there's still an impulse. Why are we going to the moon? Why are we going to Mars? It's the impulse, the drive to explore and expand the universe. And that's on the one hand. And here it gets rich and has, I think, a moral component that we all recognize. Imagine a split screen, not with we three on it, but the Titan casualty in one screen, and in the other screen, tragically, is the immigrant boat that sank off Greece in about the same time frame, with loss of vastly more lives. Every life is precious, but vastly more lives. And we don't actually have a handle on what to do in those circumstances. On paper, we do. There's a duty to rescue. Countries organize coast guards. Countries that can afford it will have a coast guard, or they'll use their navy or whatever. And there's the custom of the sea that you don't let people, just sort of float off and, God bless you, here's a loaf of bread. We don't do that. So and then, of course, the people on the migrant ship from North Africa were poor and immigrants and, didn't have a lot of fancy gear or stuff like that on the one hand, and trying just to find a better life. And on the other hand, you have five people, probably all of whom were millionaires. And I think that dimension raises deep moral issues that scholars, philosophers, clergy are going to be grappling. Our national leaders and international leaders are going to be grappling with. And that's a larger conversation. Now, I want to mention one other thing. Here I'll use my crystal ball. But before I get out my crystal ball, I'll just say, there is some precedent, and I know Paul is very familiar with this, in US law of the manifestly unsafe voyage principle. This in There are people who undertake wildly unsafe marine expeditions of one kind or another. They think they're going to make it to Fiji on on a bread box, unmotorized bread box. I'm holding in my
Well, there
hand.
was this fellow just a couple of days ago here in Hawaii who
Yes,
took a rowboat around the world and he had to be rescued.
and he had to be rescued. And I'm holding in my hand. It's Anybody can find these things. I'm holding in my hand correspondence from 2014, 15, and 16 from the Coast Guard District Commander in Miami, addressed to a man who proposed to transit from Florida to Bermuda on something called a hydropod.
Mhm.
And he was told that he was not authorized to depart because it's manifestly unsafe. Violation of this order may result in criminal penalties of up to 7 years confinement and a $40,000 fine. I don't know if you can see that, but anyway, so there is a mechanism. That the question is, how do you apply that where your jurisdictional handle may be a little fuzzy, at best a little fuzzy. And I think that is going to be an issue, particularly where you have a Canadian, Bermudan flag, a company in Everett, Washington, a French citizen, two Pakistani UK residents. I mean, how do you do that? It's one thing if you've got somebody who's leaving from a US port and wants to, do the backstroke to the Turks and Caicos Islands. It's another thing, where there's a million different jurisdictions involved. And so now I'll get to my prediction. What I think is going to emerge from this, maybe in a few years, will be an international convention on manifestly unsafe voyages. So that where you have these, so we won't have chaos at sea, a kind of lawless environment at sea where anybody with a few bucks or euros can subject coastal states to a kind of moral duty to go out and rescue them at great expense to the respective taxpayers, particularly at a time when national budgets may be under pressure. So that's Gene Fidell's
All right.
speculation.
How about Admiral Zukunft? He must have some thoughts about that very issue about ultra hazardous trips, ultra hazardous vessels.
Yeah, and it's great if you have prior knowledge that a vessel is about to set sail, especially out into international waters. But yeah, we don't have that level of awareness on a global scale, that someone's going to take on this risk. Similar to the case that Gene had mentioned with the hydropod, we also had, and this was when I was head of the Pacific Theater. Well, I'll call him elderly. He was probably about my age. I'm 68.
That's not elderly, Paul. Trust
Yeah,
me on this.
Young man, Paul.
it's the new maturity. But he was going to set out in a rowboat, with no navigation, with no distress beacons, and so I think it was a family member that alerted us, and we said this is a manifestly unsafe voyage, and here's everything you need to have. Well, then he tried to slip out of another port, and we stopped him again. And I think at that point he said, "Oh, okay, maybe this wasn't such a smart idea." But you almost need a third party to alert that someone is about to embark on a voyage of this nature. So without the level of awareness, it becomes after the fact. And we're going to continue to expend a lot of effort to humanitarianly save lives out at sea, regardless if they're an impoverished migrant or a well-heeled millionaire. It's humanity regardless.
Well, that takes me to my last question to you guys, and it's about morality. It's about Coast Guard policy and policies of other maritime agencies, namely that what is a life worth? And you go the full distance, even though you have really no prospect of being repaid for your expenses. And I think it's always been that way with the United States Coast Guard. On the other hand, in this case, there were probably 10 agencies involved, and there were millions and millions of dollars spent on and after June 18th to try to rescue these individuals and you know bring up the submersible. And they're all eating those expenses, including especially the Coast Guard. And I wonder, where does that end? This had to be a very expensive proposition. Do you have any chance of recovering any of those costs from multimillionaires and an organization built with multimillionaires, or do you let it go on the basis of that policy?
Well, the Coast Guard's policy, and Paul can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the policy decision has long been made that we don't send you a bill. I think the only situation in which they will send you a bill, let's see, that if a fishing vessel goes out with insufficient fuel, I think there was a pattern. Maybe your memory may be fresher than mine on this, but there were fishermen on the East Coast, at least, who would go out with half a tank of gas. And they get out to George's Bank, and then they'd call the Coast Guard for a tow back or for some fuel so they could get back into port. And I think in those situations they were asked to pay for the fuel. But the practice has not been to send people a bill for their own rescue.
Paul?
Yeah, and that's absolutely correct. In fact, it was those cases off Georgia's banks that created an opportunity for private salvage companies that will give you a bill because you went offshore without enough fuel. They'll bring you back if the sea states permit, and you're going to get a bill for towing the vessel or refueling, whatever. So that corrected that behavior. But a case that never gets any media coverage. But again, when I was in charge of the Pacific Theater, it's not uncommon where you have open boats leaving, parts of Micronesia going out 40, 50 miles to fish. And then we'll find out 3 days later, they never returned. And so at that point, it takes 10 hours for a C-130 to get to roughly the beginning of a search pattern, which by this time is now about half the size of the state of Texas. And you're looking for a 22-foot open boat. So those become our most costly search efforts. And oftentimes there's no more than 2 or 3 people in these boats, and we'll spend literally millions of dollars. And what goes into the search planning effort is survivability. And what we have found are that the inhabitants of Micronesia, when they set out in the open ocean, with no communication, but the first thing is they don't panic. If it rains, they'll gather rainwater. If they catch a fish, they'll eat it raw, and they'll survive for weeks on end. So we don't go out there and say, okay, well, after 3 days, we're going to suspend the search. So we put a lot of effort into that. And a lot of times they'll hop on a passing merchant ship, and then we'll find out a week later that they're now in a foreign port and so forth. But yeah, the cost of this though is all built into the Coast Guard's operating budget, and a lot of this is kind of a look backwards and looking at trends. And then when we have what I would say an off peak or a high peak, like when we had Hurricanes Harvey, Maria, and Irma hit one after the other, we were able to get supplemental funding to help recoup the expenses for all the efforts, which was a high peak search and rescue area. But right now, this would not be an anomaly in the Coast Guard's budgeting process. And again, to Gene's point, yeah, you're not getting a bill at the end of the day.
And let me say, I think that one, I'm not going to give any advice to the Marine Board. However, I think there are going to be members of Congress who are going to be willing to say, look, we're not going to provide this kind of public service at the taxpayer's expense for people who are, and it's tragic because they've lost their lives, who are basically high-end tourists. we're not going to do that anymore. And I think this may be one of those sort of iconic events, an inflection point in maritime policy and safety of life at sea, and the Coast Guard's entire operating system that it's pursued since 1790. There may be an adjustment because of this.
Oh, yeah, it does sound like an inflection point. We're out of time. Thank you very much, Gene Fidell and Admiral Paul Zukunft, former Commandant of the Coast Guard. What an honor to have you both. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jay.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Thanks so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please click on the like and subscribe buttons on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And please check out our website. That's thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.